In the dry heat of the Great Depression, when dust storms swallowed the land and the skies were painted with the ghosts of crops long gone, a man named Thomas Ericson made a decision that would change everything. He built a cabin unlike any other on the plains, a fortress against the harshest winter the Dakota Territory had ever known. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from, and if survival tales move you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just outlast this one. The first snow fell on Dakota Territory like a whisper, soft and silent at first, but then the winds began to howl. It was the 15th of October 1880, weeks ahead of the expected storms. The air was frigid, the kind of cold that crept into your bones and set up shop. By noon, snow was falling at a furious pace, thick and fast, piling up in drifts that swallowed the prairie whole. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero. For most settlers, this was a sign of disaster. They had been preparing for winter, yes, but only just. Their cabins were hastily built with single walls, small windows, and roofs that leaked in the rain, let alone the snow. They had heard whispers of a long, brutal winter, but they had no idea how severe it would be. No one had ever imagined it would come so quickly. In the midst of this chaos, Thomas Ericson continued working on his cabin. The other settlers, huddling inside their crude shelters, couldn't fathom why he was still building, why he hadn't just finished up and hunkered down. His cabin was large, too large. It had thick walls, double thick, with sawdust packed between them. He had even built a stone foundation, something no one had done. "You're a fool," they said. "You'll freeze before your cabin is finished." But Ericson, a Norwegian immigrant with a hard, practical eye, wasn't afraid. He'd seen worse winters. He'd worked in Wisconsin lumber camps, watched men freeze to death in poorly built shacks. He knew that in this new land, this harsh land, you couldn't just build for what you thought would happen, you had to build for the worst, and that meant taking your time. While the rest of the prairie was bathed in the frantic energy of survival, Ericson was steady, deliberate. Every log he placed was carefully chosen, every notch was measured, and every piece of insulation packed tight. He would not rush, he would not cut corners. He was building a fortress, not just a cabin. By the time the blizzard raged outside, Ericson's cabin had walls that stood firm against the storm. The rest of the prairie wasn't so lucky. As snow piled higher and higher, cutting off settlements from the rest of the world, Ericson's neighbors were scrambling to keep warm, to keep the wind out. And in the days that followed, as the storm lingered and the cold set in, many of them would discover what Ericson already knew: the difference between building to survive and building to hope. The blizzards that swept across Dakota Territory in late October were only the beginning. November came with more snow, and December delivered 5 more storms. By January, the land was buried under a white, suffocating blanket, and the settlers' worst fears were realized. The trains had stopped running. The supplies they had relied on, flour, kerosene, sugar, were gone. What remained was the land itself, harsh and unforgiving. Ericson's neighbors, who had once mocked him for his careful construction, were now feeling the weight of their hastily made homes. The cold didn't just seep in through the cracks, it poured in like water through a broken dam. William Crawford, who lived just 5 miles south of Ericson, had been one of the loudest critics of Ericson's excessive cabin. Now, he and his wife were huddled together by a fire, trying to keep warm in a cabin with single thick walls that let the wind cut through the room like a knife. They burned everything they could find to stay alive, but it wasn't enough. Ericson's cabin, in contrast, stood like a sentinel in the storm. The double-thick walls kept the cold at bay, the stone foundation held steady, and the sawdust insulation did what it was supposed to do. Inside, the fire burned steadily, and the warmth inside was real, not just a flickering illusion. Ericson had prepared for this. He had built for the worst, not for the average. As word of Ericson's cabin spread, others began to make the trek to his doorstep, seeking shelter from the storm. Peter Johnson, who lived 5 miles north, arrived first. His wife had pneumonia, his children were suffering from frostbite, and they had no firewood left. When they stumbled upon Ericson's cabin, they didn't knock, they collapsed inside, desperate and freezing. Ericson didn't ask questions. He immediately set to work. He placed Johnson's wife in his own bed, covered her with blankets, and began making hot food. The children were wrapped in quilts and placed near the fire. For 3 days, the Johnson family stayed in the warmth of Ericson's cabin, their lives saved by the man they had once called a fool. As they left, Johnson promised to return, to send anyone else who needed refuge. The word spread quickly, as it always did in these small, tight-knit communities. Ericson's cabin became a place of hope, a beacon in the storm. But the storm raged on. It didn't stop. The snow kept falling, and the wind howled with a fury that made it impossible for anyone to do anything except survive. The rest of the prairie struggled, their homes inadequate against the elements. Many had already lost everything: livestock, crops, and worse, their loved ones. And when the storm finally broke, when the sun emerged from behind the clouds in late spring, it became clear: survival was not a given. It never had been. But Ericson's cabin, the one they had mocked, had proven that sometimes doing things right meant doing them slowly, and that, sometimes, the difference between life and death is nothing more than preparation. By the time the heart of winter settled over Dakota territory, the ground was frozen solid. The wind screamed down the plains, bending the few remaining trees until they snapped like brittle twigs. The snow that had started so suddenly in October had become a constant companion. For months, it had buried the landscape beneath layers of ice and frost. But it wasn't just the snow that people feared. It was the isolation, the lack of supplies, the constant, grinding cold that wore a person down piece by piece. Most of the homesteaders had built their cabins quickly, focusing on getting anything up before winter. Now, as the snow piled higher, they found themselves caught in a deadly game of catch-up. The cattle that had once roamed the plains lay frozen in the fields, victims of the storm. Neighbors, too, had fallen, unable to survive the harsh conditions in their poorly built homes. Ericson's cabin stood in stark contrast. While the blizzards raged outside, it stood as a solitary refuge, unwavering and warm. He had spent months preparing, and now, in the dead of winter, that preparation paid off. The walls, thick with insulation, held the heat of the fire within. His stone foundation kept the floor dry and warm, and his roof, built with layers of sod and boards, shed snow without letting any inside. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a testament to foresight, a symbol of survival against nature's unforgiving force. And while Ericson had built his cabin for himself, others began to realize its value. Word of the cabin's refuge spread like wildfire through the community. Families that were struggling to stay warm, neighbors whose homes were no match for the relentless storm, started to arrive at Ericson's doorstep. There was no judgment in Ericson's heart when they came. No part of him said, "I told you so," when they knocked at his door, desperate and cold. Instead, he welcomed them in without hesitation. He had prepared for this. He had built for the worst. Each day brought new faces, families struggling to survive, children huddled together for warmth. The cabin became a temporary shelter for many, a place to rest, to regain strength, to wait out the storm. For those who couldn't make it on their own, Ericson's cabin was the last chance at survival. Among those who arrived seeking refuge was William Crawford, the man who had mocked Ericson's careful construction. He had lost his wife to pneumonia, caught in the cold of his own hastily built home. Crawford had barely survived the storm himself, and now, standing in the warmth of Ericson's cabin, he saw with stark clarity the price of his own impatience. His eyes took in the steady flame in the hearth, the warmth that filled every corner of the room, and he realized just how close he had come to losing everything. Ericson didn't speak of it. He didn't rub it in. Instead, he offered a place to rest, food to eat, and warmth to stave off the cold. But Crawford, looking around, felt the weight of his own choices, the lessons learned too late. When Ericson shared his firewood, his food, and his shelter with those in need, it was an act of quiet defiance against the world that had mocked him. Ericson had built something that could withstand the worst the land had to offer, and it was working. By the time February arrived, the harsh winter had already claimed much of the land. The prairie, once full of life, now seemed like an endless expanse of snow and ice. The railroad tracks had long since been buried beneath snowdrifts so high that no train could pass. Supplies were dwindling, and those who hadn't prepared were now faced with the grim reality of survival. Thomas Ericson's cabin had become a lifeline for many. His reputation as a man who had built not just for comfort but for survival had spread far and wide, but even as the winter continued to ravage the land, Ericson remained steady. He had made sure to store enough food, firewood, and supplies to last the entire winter. His careful preparation had ensured that no matter how bad it got, his family and anyone who sought shelter would survive. In the final months of the storm, Ericson's cabin became the center of a small community of survivors. Families shared meals together, warmed by the fire and comforted by the fact that they were safe for now. There was no electricity, no radio to broadcast the outside world's turmoil. There was only the company of those who had made it through the worst and those still struggling to survive. Yet, as the weeks wore on, the relentless cold and isolation began to take its toll. The land, covered in snow, seemed to stretch on forever, and the silence that hung over the prairie was a constant reminder of the danger outside. There were moments when even the most prepared began to question if they would make it to spring. Ericson, however, had never lost faith in the strength of his cabin. As the wind howled and snow continued to fall, he simply carried on. There was work to do, wood to chop, the fire to tend, supplies to ration, and he did it all without complaint. The lesson he had learned long ago was clear. Survival was about consistency, about perseverance. It was about not giving up, even when it seemed like everything else was crumbling. One evening, as the sun set behind the snow-covered plains, Ericson sat by the fire, his family gathered around him. They were tired of the storms, tired of the endless days, tired of the fear that still clung to the air. But as Ericson looked around the room, he knew they would make it. They had everything they needed: warmth, food, each other. The hardest part of the storm was over, but the winter still had a long way to go. With every passing day, the snow continued to fall, and the cold, though it seemed endless, would eventually subside. What mattered was that they had survived. The lesson of the winter would last long after the snow had melted. In this harsh, unforgiving world, the difference between life and death was often made by the strength of the shelter you had built before the storm arrived. And Thomas Ericson had built his shelter well. The spring thaw arrived quietly, as it always does on the plains. But by the time it came, the damage was already done. The land, still wrapped in the scars of winter, lay beneath a blanket of melting snow and ice. The few remaining settlers who had managed to survive the storm began to emerge from their cabins, blinking against the pale sun, their bodies stiff from months of huddling in the warmth of their homes. The trains had finally managed to dig their way through the snowdrifts, but the damage to the settlement was irreversible. Livestock had perished, fields were barren, and entire homesteads were abandoned as families left in search of better prospects. Those who had not made it through the storm, those who had lost everything, were gone. The trail of death had left behind a heavy silence, one that weighed on the shoulders of every survivor who remained. In the midst of this fragile new beginning stood Ericson's cabin, still strong, still standing, as it had been through the darkest days of winter. The thick walls, the carefully chinked wood, the sawdust insulation, it had all paid off. When the worst came, the cabin had endured. And for those who had sought refuge within its walls, it had been the difference between life and death. But with spring came the sobering realization that survival was not the end of the struggle. The world outside had changed forever. Those who had once mocked Ericson's careful construction now came to him for advice. Their cabins, hastily thrown up and built for speed, had not withstood the storm. They had been casualties of their own hubris. But Thomas Ericson did not gloat. Instead, he helped, quietly and without fanfare. He shared what he had learned about building, about surviving, and taught others the lessons he had learned at great cost. The mockery that had once surrounded Ericson's cabin now turned into a quiet admiration. He had been proven right in the harshest way possible. And as the others rebuilt their homes with thicker walls, stronger foundations, and better insulation, they did so with Ericson's teachings in mind. Slowly, the settlement began to heal. The cabin that had once been seen as excessive now became a symbol of survival, a testament to the wisdom of caution in the face of adversity. But for Ericson, the work didn't stop with the storm. There was still more to do. The land, scarred by the long winter, would not immediately yield its bounty. Spring had come too late for the crops, and the soil, dry and cracked, would take years to recover. Ericson's homestead, like many others, was a reflection of the trials that lay ahead. The loss had been great, but there was still a chance to rebuild, to try again. Ericson looked out over the land, what was left of it, and felt the weight of the past months. He had survived the storm, but so many others had not. His cabin had stood, but the cost of its endurance had been high. It was not just the physical labor of construction, but the emotional toll it took to survive in a place that could so easily turn against you. As he turned back to the cabin, he realized that the true strength of his survival was not just in the walls he had built, but in the quiet resilience to face whatever would come next. The story of the winter of 1880 would become legend, a lesson passed down through generations. It would be told around campfires, in homes, and across the land. It would remind those who heard it that sometimes the greatest acts of survival are those that happen before the storm arrives. For in the end, what truly matters is not whether you can withstand the storm, but whether you've built something strong enough to survive it. As the first blooms of spring began to peek through the earth, Thomas Ericson walked back into his cabin, knowing that his place in this world had been secured. He had done what he needed to do, and now, as the land slowly healed, he could rest, knowing that his legacy would live on, not just in the walls of his cabin, but in the hearts of those he had helped survive the long winter.